Hello, everyone. My name is Lisa Berkeley, and I'm president of the Marina Democratic Club, and I also sit on the Democratic Women of Monterey County Board. And today's event is brought to you, as you may have seen in the initial introductory club, by the Marina Dems, co-sponsored by the DWMC, the Democratic Women of Monterey County, Housing is a Human Right, and Monterey County Renters United. And I'm very excited for this conversation today. We have with us Susie Shannon, who is the Policy Director for Housing is a Human Right, and she's also the Democratic Chair of the Poverty Council of the Democratic National Committee. And then we have Esther Malkin, who is the founding director of Monterey County Renters United and who serves on the board of the Housing Resource Center of Monterey County and is also on the board of the California Democratic Renters Council. So, welcome, Susie and Esther. So what we're going to do today is Esther is going to give us a presentation talking about what are the issues around renters and how its impact, how the impact that they play on the housing market. And then Susie's going to speak about some of what's being done to protect renters and to keep people in their homes. So with that, I'm going to turn this over to you, Esther.
Good evening, everybody. Thanks for taking time out for this important conversation that is actually pretty complicated. And I'm happy to answer any questions at the end, or you can reach out to me separately. So, Lisa, do you have the slides up? Because I'm not seeing.
Yeah, I'm going to put them up in 1 second. One thing
Oh,
I did forget to say is that each person is going to give their presentation and then we're going to have a Q&A at the end. Okay, so let's go. Okay, 1 second.
so
Okay.
you can see in the slides that we were showing while we were waiting that the headlines have been pretty much all over the place, whether it's on TV or print media, online. It is a fact that homelessness prevention is affordable rents. We have data showing, government data showing that as rents increase, we absolutely have increased homelessness. So, next slide, Lisa.
I'm trying. There we go.
Here we go. So this is a complex topic, obviously. And unfortunately, what you normally hear about most is new development. Everybody that's in, elected officials, city councils, um, developers, nonprofits, many of them focus on the fact that the lack of supply is what's creating this outrageous skyrocketing rent. And that's all true. But if we don't talk about how we are going to get a hold of these climbing rents, we're not going to be able to build fast enough, and we're going to just get more and more expensive, and we're going to keep losing people that are living in our cities and our region in the state. And so it's really important to talk about these two things simultaneously. So we're going to concentrate on the renter problem, not the new development side of the conversation. So we know housing is a human right. I mean, basically, you cannot have a productive or decent life without having housing, and that's not a new concept. The United Nations, promoted this human right back in 1948, and unfortunately, we have not had a lot of good progress since then on preventing homelessness. We've actually had more homelessness. The United Nations has sent teams over to LA and San Francisco over the last decade, and they've actually were horrified to see that the housing encampments and the homelessness in those two major US cities were as bad as in third world cities. And that's really scary when you think about it, because the United States is supposed to be ahead of the game with this. And unfortunately, we are not. There are many, many countries in the world that have less homelessness than we do. So this is why we have to focus on this as a societal problem. It's also a justice problem because it's disproportionately affecting minorities and women, and it is important for those groups of people to be housed so that they can have lives that are stable enough to be able to continue excuse me, onto the rest of their life. With housing, they are able to find work, they can go to school, there's less trauma, there's all kinds of sorry, I got a frog in my throat. So it is important for us to really make it a point to look at this affordable rent problem as a homelessness prevention issue. Next slide, Lisa. There we go. So we know that these are some of the things I just mentioned, so I don't want to spend a lot of time on it. You can take a look at it, and you can understand that why it's so important that you have to have some stable housing. So we also know for sure that, again, it's disproportionately affecting the ethnic populations. And we know that families in the last decade and a half have been more affected than ever before. When the recession back in 2008, 2009 happened, all those foreclosures that took place, that, you know, when Wall Street was making it possible for people who couldn't afford homes really to get into the subprime market, they foreclosed on those homes. And unfortunately, when those people that were homeowners became renters, they took up a lot of the housing, the rental stock that we had, and it created even a tighter market than we had in the first place. Next. So this is a pretty scary statistic that I actually just came upon, and it's a recent study, as you can see, in 2020. So an increase of just $100 median rent was associated with a 9% increase of estimated homelessness. So imagine that the average rent increases right now are $2,000. Their average rents are $2,000 a month. And what happens is that AB 1482, which was put in place in January of 2020, limits the maximum rent increases to 10% annually. So that 10% adds up to about $200 an increase in your rent, which therefore creates an 18% increase in homelessness. That should really be troubling to everybody who is concerned about homelessness, because that is not something that we can take care of going the way that we've been going. Next slide. So we have this information from the National Low Income Housing Coalition that in the state of California, you would have to work 83 hours at minimum wage to be able to afford a one-bedroom modest apartment. And that obviously is not what people are able to do, but that gives you an idea of how many multiple jobs renters have to have when they have to find a place to live in our state. In our cities, in Monterey, you would have to make $38 an hour, $60 an hour in Santa Cruz, and $32 an hour in San Benito County.
Esther, just to interrupt you for a moment, in the chart that you're showing, it talks about the term AMI. Can you please clarify if people don't know what that is?
AMI is the average median income, and it's a complicated topic, but HUD, the Housing Urban Development Agency, comes up with annual numbers on what is supposed to be an affordable rent for people in that area. And it's adjusted by city. It's adjusted, I don't know if it's adjusted annually, but it does get adjusted. And so this is the most recent that we have right now, which was 2021 data. So, you know, it's pretty telling because it's not very practical in a county like ours, especially because we're such a large county that what happens is the average rents from South County end up bringing down the average that makes it look like we are more reasonably priced than we actually are on the peninsula. So a lot of times you'll hear people say, well, just move away and, move away and, go find a job that you can work near where you live or whatever. But we can't afford to have that happen as a region or as a state. It's not, the people that are doing these jobs cannot commute an hour, especially at the recent gas prices, to these low wage jobs. It's ridiculous to expect that to be a solution. But very often in the circles that we talk to people about trying to make this problem understood, that's somehow offered as a solution. And recently, I just read a study that was the Public Policy Institute of California that said that most of the people that are leaving California are low to moderate income. 37% of those residents, 37% of total residents in California have considered leaving. We just cannot have that many people leaving. And besides the workforce effects and the obvious things that we're all familiar with, we have to think about this in a bigger picture. If we lose so many people from our areas, our funding goes down. We've seen it already this time around. We've had schools lose funding because there aren't enough, kids coming into the area. Teachers aren't coming to the area. We're losing district votes and everything. We're losing power as we lose people. So we can't afford to not have a good amount of representation in Washington because we're losing people from our state. I hope that makes sense. I'm not sure if I'm being real clear about that. But anyway, so here you see that locally, these are the proportions of the renters to all residents in our cities in this county. And unfortunately, the majority of the residents in our cities are renters, but very few are represented on the bodies of government that are the ones that would be creating policy to help renters. So where we are in general, Lisa, I think next slide, is you can see how wages have not kept up with rent. And that's been going on for decades. That's not something new. But, most of us have been renters at some point in our lives. I remember when I was in college, it was a big deal. You get to rent your own place. It's kind of like a rite of passage to adulthood. And, then you go and you get a good job and you rent again a nicer place. And then you save up money to buy a house. And that's what I did. And that's what many of you did. But being a renter now isn't the same as it was 20, 30, 40 years ago, because home ownership is just out of reach for most of us at this point, including myself. I myself have been a renter. Then I owned the home that I lived in when I got married. And then I was able to go ahead and purchase another home when I moved. And then that home when I moved again turned into a rental. So I know what it's like to be a mom and pop landlord, a true mom and pop landlord. And I can tell you that I don't come to this from the unrealistic approach that some of you may have heard, like the cancel rent movement. That's just not practical and it's not reasonable. But we do have a problem regardless, and it has to be addressed. So we all have a stake in this. When you think about how many people cross your path in 1 or 2 days of your life, whether it's a grocery store worker or a barista or a medical assistant or a city worker, all of those people can't afford to live anywhere near where they work. And we're pricing them out of our region, ultimately our state as well. So this is why we all have a stake in this. And none of us want to see more homelessness, not the businesses, not the residents in their neighborhoods. But if we don't address the rents, we will continue to increase homelessness because there's no way that we can build fast enough. So I had been working on this issue for way before anybody knew what COVID was. Nobody ever heard the word COVID. And luckily, we got the AB 1482 passed that started right before COVID. So what that did is it limited the maximum increase rents annually to 5% plus CPI, which is the consumer price index. What happened with that is that it became almost an incentive for landlords to flip properties, because it's the maximum that they were able to increase rent only applied to the people that were renewing their leases. But when you have somebody that's going to be looking at a new place, or the property's been vacated, they can reset the rent to an unlimited amount. And that's created a gigantic problem, because it's displaced a lot of people, because once they were looking for a new place because they had to vacate where they were, the inventory that was available for them to look at it for a new place were all units that were reset upon them being vacated. So it's a good bill to have, especially when you look around now in the rest of the nation. There are cities that have 30 and 40 and 50% increases in their rents. And they are actually looking to us, because we had 1482 in place before the pandemic. But the pandemic proved what we had been telling everybody was going to happen, which was the workers are going to be not going to be leaving if we don't have a way of helping them out. So for the pandemic, we had been asking for renter assistance programs for years before, and all of a sudden the renter assistance programs started popping up because the businesses couldn't afford to lose their workers, and everybody needed to stay housed. The problem with 1482 is also that it's a 10-year bill. It's not an indefinite limit on that, on those rents. So we've got to find a solution between now and then, either to make a permanent bill that isn't going to expire, or we've got to build really, really fast. And there is no way that we can build fast enough in that time frame to address the current numbers and the future numbers, because if we don't take care of this now, we are just adding water to a leaking bucket. The more people that we house, because tons and millions of dollars are being thrown at homelessness prevention programs, and people have to become homeless to qualify for those, we're going to keep adding more people that become homeless. So we never get to catch up, ever. So it's really important for us to start understanding how this affects all of us directly. Even if we're homeowners, business owners, it's not even a question of being empathetic anymore. It's just a question of being sustainable as a region, with everybody being able to be housed and keeping our workers here. I will give you a perfect example of something that all these years that I've been talking about housing. I used to use the example, which we're kind of in right now. I used to say to these elected officials and at meetings that I was at, I would say, imagine if during car week, everybody who really can't afford a one-bedroom apartment, now remember, they have to make $38 an hour and work 83 hours for that in Monterey. If all of the people that can't afford that walked off their jobs during car week, what would happen to our area? And that holds true for every event and every single day of our lives. We cannot function without addressing these jobs, these workers, and paying them enough to be able to live near where they work. It's not something that's easy, but it's something that we all have to understand the effect that it has on all of us. So homeownership has become really unattainable, and it disproportionately affects the minorities. The problems, that they have specifically is they've never really been able to spend a lot of money on the Wall Street ways of making money. So they've been able to use home ownership as a way to create generational wealth, and they can pass it along to their family members. removing that from their equation makes it really impossible for them to become homeowners. So when there's a lot of focus on first-time homebuyer programs in DC and in other areas that are trying to create those programs, that's not a very practical approach, because most renters are living paycheck to paycheck. So how are they ever going to be able to put aside even a tiny amount of money to be able to come up with a down payment? In 1968, we created the Fair Housing Act. Back then, the gap between white and black home ownership was giant by comparison to before that act was in place. But right now, we have the largest gap in history between those two groups of home ownership, with 41% lower rates of black home ownership than in 1960. And it is predicted that by 2040, it will be an additional 41% of the numbers that we have now. So we're talking about a huge disparity in who is going to be able to be a homeowner and who won't be. And we have just yesterday, the San Francisco Chronicle put out a large article on a study that they did on the least affordable counties in the state. Monterey County was the #1 least affordable county for home ownership. Santa Cruz was next. San Luis Obispo was after. That tells you how far behind we are going to be in being able to address these problems if we aren't talking about the renter issue and just talking about building and first-time homeowner programs.
Esther, this has been terrific information. Do you want to give a final word or two about? I know you wanted to wind this up as a reminder to have voters recall their power. So shall we say? So can we just spend like
Right.
maybe 2 minutes on that?
Yeah. So what we want to make sure is that when we go into this election season, is that when every candidate talks about supporting affordable housing, we need to ask them exactly what they mean by that. Because there's not a candidate, regardless of what party they are in, that can't say they support affordable housing and get elected while we're in this crisis. The devil's in the details, though, right? Because if they only support affordable housing by talking about increasing supply and don't simultaneously have an answer for how we're going to manage the rent problem, they're being disingenuous. And that does not mean they support affordable housing. That means they support development. So that's very important for us to call these elected officials out and hold their feet to the fire on this, because everybody prefers to talk about the new and building, but until we can get that done, and obviously we're in an even worse position with the drought, that's kind of almost irrelevant. So we want to make sure that everybody gets the vote out. The renters are the majority of the residents in almost all our cities. If we motivate the renters to get out and vote, we can put in place elected officials that won't be afraid to address this, that won't be kowtowing to the business interests and the lobbies that have been fighting, the few of us that are able to even have this conversation going, but they have so much money that they kill our bills. We had 2 rent control bills that have already been nixed in the last couple of elections. And it is important that if we all get the vote out and make sure that we get these candidates to understand that we're not kidding around anymore, that this rent problem has become so out of control that it is affecting our homeless problem. That is one way that we can all make a difference. And just to close, I want to mention that I've worked with Congressman Jimmy Panetta, for the last couple of years on these topics. And he just recently put 3 bills in place that hopefully will help incentivize more building for middle income housing in addition to low income, as well as the renter income tax credit that I've been asking him for. And the state of California really recently raised the income tax credit that they had, but it's only for people that make $40,000 a year or less. The federal one that Jimmy is proposing is for people who make 100,000 and less, because at this rate, the middle class no longer really can afford to be excluded from so many of the programs that are out there that you can only qualify for once you're already homeless. Thanks.
Esther, thank you so much for that excellent presentation. We're now going to turn to Susie and let her take it away from there.
Great, thanks so much. Thank you again for doing this, Lisa and Esther. That was such a great presentation in terms of what's going on. So I live in Los Angeles, which is the homeless capital of the United States, and we are a cautionary tale for the rest of California. Rents are very high here, obviously, but what we've seen, and there have been a lot of studies, is that as rents go up, obviously homelessness goes up. And so Zillow actually did a study that showed that for every 5% increase in rent, 2,000 more people become unhoused. Where I work, which is on Skid Row, and have worked there since 2005, what I have seen there, you would not even believe. I have seen children rolling backpacks behind them. I have seen rats running over people at night. I've seen rats running in the gutter. I have seen people with diabetes, who have maggots coming out of wounds. I have seen people who are in wheelchairs who have nothing. All of their stuff has been stolen, no shoes. And this is really a humanitarian crisis. And it is so connected to how we see housing and how we provide housing. We really have an affordable housing crisis. And by that, I mean, we are not building enough affordable housing and we are not preserving enough affordable housing. And people can't afford to live here anymore, right? I mean, we know that. We all see it. A lot of us feel it, for renters. I have always been a renter. And my family also, when I was younger, was unhoused. So I have lived experience in a lot of the issues that I talk about. And I've been helping people since 2005. And I can tell you that when someone is unhoused, they're not going to be able to go straight into a market rate apartment. So building more market rate apartments is not actually going to help our homeless community. We need to be building, converting affordable housing. So I want to talk basically about this burgeoning rent control movement, which is really sweeping the entire United States. California, and maybe the city that you live in, is one small part of what is becoming a national movement, because people can't live almost anywhere. In the last couple of months, I have been to Chicago, Boston, New York, Washington, D.C., and it is unbelievable what people are facing in terms of rents. I can't even believe it, and I'm working, in this field. And so what we're seeing across the United States, and I'm going to use just a couple of examples. So in Illinois, there is legislation right now to lift the ban on rent control. And in Massachusetts, there's legislation to lift the ban on rent control. And in California, we've tried twice through an initiative, which Prop 10 and Prop 21, to lift the ban on rent control. So why are we doing this? Because in the 1990s, corporate developers went across the United States, state by state, and there was no national coalition of tenants or tenant organizations at that time. And they put into place a ban on rent control, which meant that you might be able to grandfather in rent control laws, like in Los Angeles. If you live in a building that was built in 1978 or before, you are under rent control. In San Francisco, it's 1979 and before, but anyone else, right, is not necessarily going to be under rent control. And so they went across the United States and enacted these laws. And it has made it so that we can't, local municipalities can no longer control skyrocketing rents, and people have become rent burdened, right? Over 50% of the people in California spend over 30% of their income on rent. And over 30% spend over 50% of their income on rent, and they are extremely rent burdened. So a number of activists in different cities, and this gives me a lot of hope, have moved for their city to lower the cost of rent increases, right? So Esther talked about AB 1482, which puts this 10% cap. It's really 5% plus the CPI. It's much easier, if you're not really into numbers, that kind of thing. Just remember 10%. So that's a ceiling. That's a very high ceiling, though. If someone were to have a 10% increase in rent every single year, they likely would be priced out within a few years, right? So we all recognize, especially with COVID and with people who have lost their jobs, and with inflation now, where it's hard to put food on the table, gas in your car, if you have a fossil fuel based car, which most of us do, it's becoming, very hard for people to survive, right? People are making decisions that are hurting themselves or their family, maybe cutting back on food, maybe not going to the doctor, and some people are ending up unhoused. And so what happened was, and what really kind of kicked this off, was a group of activists in Santa Ana moved to cap their rent increase at 3%. And they won an ordinance to make that happen. And that inspired folks in other cities. And so just a week and a half ago, and housing as a human right was a small part of this, there were a group of activists from PUSH, which is a local activist organization in Santa Ana, that got together and decided to move the council for a 3% cap in the increase in rent. So instead of 10%, it would be 3%. And it was really difficult for them to do this because they didn't just need a majority of the council, they needed 5 of the 7 council members because it was considered an emergency ordinance. And so they worked very hard. They called renters, they did lit drops, literature drops, in people's apartment buildings, going door to door. And then we helped with a part of this, which was a teletown hall. And in this teletown hall, what we do is we get a list of voters, who are in Pomona, and we have this special system that will call people, voters, and explain to them about an upcoming vote. And so in this case, we were able to get one of the council members and then 2 members from PUSH to come on and explain to voters basically what was coming up, what the ordinance was, how this would impact the community, why it was important. And then also we were able to do polling to ask how many people thought the rent was too high in Pomona. 74% of the people polled, and these are all voters, thought the rent was too high in Pomona. And all of that really helps us not only collect data, obviously, but also send a message to elected officials that we are talking to voters. We are talking to voters who are renters. We are also talking to voters who are homeowner allies, I think we'll call them, who understand that we're kind of all in this together, right? Homelessness affects us all. But if a family member can't afford their rent, that affects us too. If a family member has a 10% increase in their rent, that affects us as well. It affects our community. As Esther pointed out, it affects our schools. It affects whether families can stay together, right? If, people can live near their grandparent, if they have grandparents, and that affects who's going to watch their children. And so this is all very connected. And so, I'm so inspired by these activists. And Pomona, they won 2 weeks ago. There was a vote at City Council, and they got exactly the 5 votes that they needed. And then after that, the next day, actually, Santa Monica voted to also cap their rents. And it starts at 6% and goes down to 3%. And so we're seeing this great movement, and it's also Oxnard, Santa Barbara is moving toward this, a number of cities up north. And we're also looking at vacancy rates. So it's interesting because Esther was talking about how obviously building takes a long time, right? So there's three things we need to do. One, we need to preserve our affordable housing. So we need to make sure that people who are, leased in place in an apartment can stay there. That's number one. Number two, we need to take our vacant units and fill them. So I'll give you an example. In Los Angeles, I have a lot of LA statistics because I live here. So I do understand that most of the people on the call do not. But again, this is really a cautionary tale for anyone who lives in the United States of what not to do. In Los Angeles, in the city of LA, we have 41,000 people who are unhoused. That's in our city. In our county, we have about 66,000. However, we have over 70,000 units that are vacant. We have enough vacant units to house everyone that's in our county, just in the city when you look at vacant units. We have specific buildings downtown, which are single room occupancy hotels, but they're residential buildings for people in permanent housing. And a lot of them are empty, including a 601 room Cecil Hotel, which a lot of people know about because there was, a big Netflix documentary about how it's haunted. But the worst part about the Cecil is that it has been vacant now for decades in the middle of Skid Row, literally encampments in the shadows of this vacant building. So we need to really do an inventory of what is available in our communities for adaptive reuse. And adaptive reuse means that you're just taking existing empty buildings. They could be office buildings, it could be, commercial, it could be schools. We've seen hospitals, old hospitals converted into housing. And my organization is doing this. So in the last 4 years, we have housed 1,400 people using adaptive reuse. We literally have housed more people in the city of Los Angeles than what the city has done since 2016 when it passed Measure HHH. And we did it for $100,000 a unit. Whereas the Measure HHH funds, building from the ground up, they spent $500,000 to $700,000 a unit. You literally could buy condos for people here in LA, probably in the San Fernando Valley, for what it costs us to actually build this housing. Which is not to say we shouldn't build it, but we also have to be very smart in how we're doing it. You can lower the cost of that building by doing prefab modular housing. And that will definitely lower it. And that's where it's kind of built in the factory and then brought to the site. And then the rest of it is built up. And you can cut a couple $100,000 per unit off of the cost of housing. So there are so many solutions for actually housing folks and for keeping folks housed. In Santa Monica, they have this great program called the POD program. And it is designed to keep people in rent-controlled units who otherwise would lose them. They consider their rent-controlled units to be affordable housing because if they lose them, as Esther explained, you have vacancy decontrol. So the renter moves out, the cost of the apartment goes up to market rate, and then you're back to square one where no one can afford it. And so they actually, the city, actually pay senior citizens. They look at their income, they look at what their costs are every month, and they actually pay senior citizens what they need in order to survive so that they can stay in these rent-controlled units and don't lose them through decontrol. One of the things that we absolutely must do in California is to ensure that our local governments can enact or expand rent control. Because a lot of our local government, our city council members and our county supervisors feel, kind of shackled, right? Because they're not allowed to actually help their constituents who are renters. So we're like, my organization, Housing is a Human Right, going to go back to the ballot in 2024. We're going to try again to get the voters to vote to allow our local elected officials to make decisions for their communities that make sense. So enacting rent control, expanding rent control where it's needed, as a way to prevent homelessness, right, which is continuing to rise. With over 171,000 people who are homeless in the state of California. That number will likely go up as soon as our homeless count numbers come in. And we are still here, you know, not implementing a lot of these solutions. So again, it's preservation, which is super important, keeping people in their housing, keeping the rent control, making sure that rent increase is low, toward 3% or 4%. Building, when we build, we want to build affordable housing. When people say we just need housing, they are wrong. And I can just tell you that because we have been on that model here in Los Angeles since 2005, when I started working with our unhoused community. And I could never get anyone who was unhoused into any of the market rate apartments that were going up. And statistics wise, you know, we saw in the last 7 years in LA, we overbuilt market rate housing by 70,000 units. And we underbuilt affordable and moderate housing by 34,000 units. So unless we prioritize, you know, folks who are extremely low income, and moderate, you know, very low income and moderate, we're never going to see a change. We're going to see more vacant units, definitely, but we're not going to see the real change that we want to see. Because people keep saying, you know, we keep building housing, and yet we're seeing an increase in homelessness. And that's because we're not building the right type of housing, the housing that people really need. And I honestly don't know what it's going to take. You know, I'm also a founding member of SEIU 2015, which is our caregivers union. And these are, you know, folks who work for very little money and can't afford housing a lot of the time. I work very closely with Unite Here, which are also very low income hotel workers who also are struggling to have housing. In fact, there was a member of Unite Here who died a couple of months ago in her car. She was living in her car while she was working at a hotel because she just could not afford an apartment in Orange County. So, you know, these are real stories. I see the tragedy, you know, of all of this close up and personal with every single person that I'm talking to, I'm trying to help. At the beginning of this Zoom meeting, I got a call about a family with 3 children who are homeless. One that's 4 months old, one that's 2 years old, and one that's 3 years old, living in a tent in a park. And this is happening right now. So how we approach our housing policy, how we approach rents, how we are talking about this. I am somebody, I don't want to hear any more about market rate housing. I don't want to hear any more about housing for rich people. We have been doing so much for rich folks, I can promise you. There are a lot of people who would love to turn LA into a playground for the rich and famous, San Francisco into a playground for the rich and famous. And I don't know what it's going to take. I mean, I think maybe every Starbucks barista isn't able, you know, to work in the cities that they work in anymore because they have to drive so far to get to work. And when people can't get their Starbucks anymore, maybe that will wake them up. You know, I'm not sure what it's going to take, you know, but something has got to give. Because like Esther said, people are moving out. But some people don't even have the luxury of moving out. And when they're moving out, it's not out of California, they're moving out of their apartment and into a tent, or out of their apartment into a motel. You know, and they literally don't have anywhere to go. And it's, you know, it used to be sort of something that I saw in 2005 that was very much concentrated on Skid Row. And now a lot of places in California are now Skid Row. They are just like that, right? People can't afford their apartments. People are unhoused, living in tents. And then once they're on the street, getting them off the street and into apartment is, you know, can be a like several year struggle to get them back indoors. And we have to have all kinds of subsidies in order to keep them then even in their apartments because the rents are so high. So I will leave it there for questions.
Thank you so much, Susie. What's incredible information, and I, as I do with Esther, but I very much appreciate your dedication, care, and hard work. It's heartbreaking, and we have to come up with solutions indeed. So there are 3 questions in the chat, or in the Q&A section. One of them is I think a little bit out of the scope of this conversation, so I'm going to just stick to 2 of them. And then if anybody else wants to ask questions live, you can go ahead and raise your hand in the participant box, and we'll call on you. So this comes from, the first question comes from Darius Mosinen, and he asks, what do you want elected officials to do to make housing more affordable? I think we kind of addressed that, but that was during Esther's conversation. And Esther, do you want to say a little more on that? What?
I mean, we have to be able to lower that 10% ceiling. The reason the state put AB 1482 at that rate is basically because of the strong lobby that the California Apartments Association and the Realtors Association have a stronghold in DC as well as in Sacramento. And so for that reason, there are all the loopholes in 1482, as well as the expiration date. And so when Susie's talking about these other cities that are lowering that 10% to 3 and 4, that's what we need to strive for in our individual jurisdictions, because at these other levels of government, there's too much big money involved that they won't do it. And the problem with the 10% is, even wealthy people, do you know anybody that makes 10%, has a 10% increase in their income annually that compounds every single year? That's, even for Wall Street, a high return. But yeah, we're asking the people who are the workers that barely get a 1 or 2% income raise to come up with 10%. It's just unrealistic and unsustainable.
Right. So, okay, that's great. I'm going to jump then to Susie. Susie, can you say more of what an elected official can do?
Sure. One thing is they have to stop listening to corporate developers, because corporate developers are there to get profit. They are not there to make sure that people can afford their housing. So that's number 1. Number 2, they can support eliminating Costa-Hawkins. Costa-Hawkins is a law that was passed in 1996 that basically says that local governments have no control over the rents of the people who live there. So if you, like I said, if you're a council member and you want to pass rent control, you basically are shackled by Costa-Hawkins. They can work to get rid of Costa-Hawkins. That means either through legislation, which would be great if our state legislature just decided, look, Costa-Hawkins has, pretty much wrecked California's housing market for renters, and we're going to get rid of it. That would be great. There's also a bill called the Ellis Act, and this allows landlords to take rent-controlled units off the market and convert them to condos. And so we need to stop doing that too. That's part of preserving our housing stock, and that's really important. 2, they need to make sure they are building affordable housing. And that means, does that mean we hate market rate housing? We're never going to build? No. But look, I can tell you in LA, and I can tell you in San Francisco and most places in California, we are overbuilding market rate housing. You don't have to take my word for it. Go to something called the housing element. Every single city and county has a housing element, and they will show you the last 7 years of what's happened in your city. And in almost every single city, based on the RENA numbers, which are regional housing needs assessment numbers, these cities have overbuilt market rate because that's what developers want to build, because they actually make money off of that. They've underbuilt affordable housing. We need to put more of our money, more of our time and effort into affordable housing, because who gets left holding the bag, right? Because if you're not moved from a humanitarian argument on homelessness, I've got news for you. Who gets left holding the bag when we have increased homelessness? It's taxpayers. We pay $45,000 to $55,000 per person per year for everyone who is chronically homeless on the streets. That's homeless for over a year or four times in 5 years. Okay, we pay for that. And it's the politicians and elected officials who get holding the bag. Because I guarantee you, no one says, oh my God, look at the increase in homelessness in my neighborhood. Damn those corporate developers. They don't say that. They go, what is wrong with our city council? What is wrong with our county supervisors? What is wrong with our elected officials in the state? They're the ones who get blamed. They're the ones who get left holding the bag. So they need to stop listening to the people who have wrecked things, which are the corporate developers. They need to start focusing on the housing that is needed the most. For me, I think it's like triage. Like, if you went into an emergency room and the doctor, took the person with the broken finger or toe before they took the person who's having a heart attack, you would think that you were, that something was wrong, that you lived in a topsy-turvy world. But yet we actually have people making the case for building housing for people who already have housing above those who are unhoused, right? And so we need to take the emergency situations first. Those are people who are unhoused. We know how many people we have in each of these cities and counties, but we also know that there are people who are losing housing as well. So we need to provide for the folks who have been ignored now for decades. And then we can get to your market rate housing model.
Terrific. Thank you. Robert Mendoza, you have a question, so we're going to allow you to talk. You can go ahead and unmute yourself, and please be brief and direct with your question so we can have other people.
Yes, I'm a veteran. I live in Pacific Grove, and I can't even afford to buy with no down payment. That's pretty bad. But what I see is there was a report that one of the reasons why this investors, private investors, are buying 5, 10, 15, 20 houses. I cannot compete with those investors. How can I compete with them? And it's sad that it's crazy that we as taxpayers or trying to be a single homeowner, trying to compete with somebody who's got 3, 4, 5, 6 houses already. Right. That they got the money. Yeah, they got collateral. They got this.
Robert, I'm sorry to interrupt you. Do you have a question?
Well, what can be done on the state level to, if an investor invests and buys a house, he's got to stay in that house, just like we do as a veteran. I got to live in a house in order to buy a house. This guys, they buy 10 houses and then charge rent like you were talking about. That's all. That's all I got.
It's a really good comment. And first, thank you for your service. And I'm sorry that we're in this situation. But Esther or Susie or Esther, do you want to take that comment?
Yeah. I mean, just here in LA, there was a company called Invitation Homes. They're a corporate developer, and during 2008, people were losing their homes. They went into South Los Angeles. They bought up all the single-family homes, and then people, the homeowners left, right, because they were foreclosed on. And then they raised the rents for all the people who were renting these single-family homes, gentrified the neighborhood, fewer people of color living there, and this should be illegal, right? Like how is it that we have a society where a family who desperately needs to buy a single family home has to compete against Blackstone and Invitation Homes and these billion-dollar corporate developers who are merely buying this property as a quote unquote investment, right? So we need to get back to making sure that the people who are buying our single family homes, buying condominiums, are real people, not real people, as defined, for campaign finance reform, but actual people buying properties that are needed. And that really strengthens neighborhoods too, right? It strengthens neighborhoods. It keeps families together, first generation, second generation. And we need our state officials to understand that no longer do we want families competing with corporate developers for housing. Okay, housing is not a car. Housing is not tennis balls. Housing is one of the social determinants of health. I'm also a health commissioner for the city of Los Angeles, and we look into these issues very closely. This is a social determinant of health. When you don't have housing, you're more likely to die. When you don't have housing, you're more likely never to see a doctor, right? When you don't have housing, you're more susceptible to hepatitis, to a number of different diseases. And we understand that. But somehow we get caught up in this dialogue about investments and profits, and as though housing is like just any other commodity, or that it's even a commodity. We need to get out of that way of thinking, and it should absolutely be illegal for any corporate developer to go in and buy up a neighborhood and to compete against families who are trying to scrape by to get that like elusive down payment, and then they go in and they can't compete. I mean, we hear this time and time again, families, they can't compete to buy housing. So, and I would love to hear all the market rate supply side people. I would like to hear them talk about that.
Yeah.
I want to add to that with what happens when these corporate developers, especially the giant ones like Blackstone, Greystar, they come in and they use artificial intelligence all throughout the country, and they buy up single family homes and apartment complexes before they even hit the market practically, and they come in loaded with cash. So people can't afford to compete against them. And what happens is when they do those things, they turn those units that they buy into rentals, and then they use their management company arm to manage those properties as rentals. Therefore, they're actually, with the numbers of units that they are purchasing, they are controlling the market rate. Because when you have so many units going up at a price that other mom and pops would never have thought of doing, it falsely inflates the market rate. And the market rate is the very excuse that is used for renters to have these 10% increases. So the corporate investment problem is huge. We had a corporate investor come in and buy a whole city block in PG. I mean, every single house on that block was bought. You can't allow that to happen. They have no stake in our communities. They don't care about anything other than making money. And then it's not just the giant corporations. Locally, we have some management companies that are called management companies, and it makes you feel, it gives the illusion that they're just managing a bunch of mom and pop properties. But that's not necessarily the case. We have one particularly named Mangold that manages 3,000 units, but they don't just manage them. They own a gigantic portion of them. So they have a stake in raising the rents and raising, whether it's to their mom and pops, because the higher the rents go, the more commission they make on what they're asking these homeowners for to manage their properties. But by having that kind of a stronghold on all the units, you end up manipulating the market rate. And it's just like when the airlines started charging for baggage, $25 a bag, and everybody was horrified. And oh my God, that's crazy. Well, now it's the standard. It's like that with everything that we're talking about when it comes to rents. They've jacked up the deposits, the requirements to get into these units. It's insane that for a person to be able to get into a studio by one of these types of management companies now, they have to come up with $5,000 of a deposit, and they have to make income that's 2.5 to 3 times more than what the rents are monthly rent is. It's just not practical.
Yeah. Thank you. Paula Pillow had her hand up. Paula, did you want to, although now I don't see it, so I don't know if you still have a question. Oh, whoops. Hold on. We got Matt. Hi, Matt. Um, nope. Paula, hold on. There we go.
Are you ready for me?
I'm ready for you. Yeah, sorry. We've got
Okay.
Matt in here by
So
mistake. Sorry.
thank you one and all for your presentation. I wanted to emphasize and ask a question about this. You pointed out how there are global investment companies, large, who have, you know, billions of dollars, Blackstone, Greystar, who purchase these houses for home ownership, and they raise the prices on that. They price out people who cannot afford these prices. That forces them into the rental markets that they are also controlling, either by ownership or by management. And one of the ways that that's done is the fact that there is not vacancy control. So rents can be reset at any level. So they wind up creating a market that these mom and pop also come along. I recognize what you're saying, Esther. They're not all really mom and pops. They're just smaller companies, but they raise those rents. So can you talk about that a little bit more, about how that inspires the other locals to follow suit and point to a market level that is not, I mean, it's an artificial setup basically that they have created, and they point to that as a market rate. And then secondary to that, Susie, you talked about this a little bit, and I think you did too, Esther. If you could speak a little bit more about the need for affordable housing for people of median and moderate income, because when we talk about these things, often we're talking about people who are in below market rate, you know, low and very low. But the fact of the matter is this tube, moderate and median income people are being squeezed out. And oftentimes self-evict, you know, they have to leave a place, but they don't want to go through the eviction because they will never get another unit again with that on their record. So if either one of you could speak to that a little bit, I would like to hear about that.
Great. Thank you.
Go ahead, Susie.
Okay. Okay, so let's talk about the missing middle, because we hear a lot about the missing middle, but then as people talk about it, that missing middle becomes more and more market rate for people for, you know, luxury housing that, you know, a waitress with 2 kids can't afford, a middle manager can't really afford. And so as we see this growing disparity between the rich and everyone else, and you know, these apartments that are being built, you know, the new market rate housing is mainly for people, you know, who make over 6 figures. As Esther said, you know, you should be making 3 times the amount of your rent, right? So 1/3 of your income or less should be spent on housing. So as you know, in New York, you can see you have to make about $150,000 to $170,000 to even afford an apartment now in Manhattan. You know, in LA, $120,000 to $130,000. And it's actually getting worse, right? So the rent is increasing, the wages are stagnant, right? So as you go along with these rent increases, things are getting worse and worse and worse. So I think, you know, if we're going to talk about the missing middle, we really need to understand that we should be talking about 80% of the area median income and below, because those are the folks that are not being built for. And we are, you know, if you just let developers do whatever they want, they're going to build for people who are wealthy. They're going to build at the highest level of income they're allowed to build. They are going to lease up to the highest level of income they can, because they think the people who make more money are more stable and more able to pay their rent. And everyone else is losing out. So, you know, if you don't make 6 figures in California, good luck. Because right now the elected officials are really not focused on you. They're not focused on you or your family or your children who you may want to actually live in the city that they grew up in. They're not focused on anything. They're buying into a lot of rhetoric that sounds really good, and they're getting a lot of campaign donations coming in from corporate developers who want to reshape our cities, and they have a whole group of people that are on the internet and will bully folks into believing that like housing is like tennis balls and just let the market do what it wants. That is a prescription of disaster. We are the homeless capital of the United States now in LA. We have been on that model now for over 20 years. It's a terrible model.
Susie, can you speak to some of the bills that you know that are in the pipeline that might address some of the things? Are you on top of that? I know that
Well, wait, I just want to before we jump on that, because I'm going to switch over to the Q&A section, and that was one of the questions there. Is there any more that either of you want to say to complete your responses to Paula's comment?
I believe, I mean, I mentioned, I think before she, right before she asked her question, the problem and how the property management companies and the global giants are manipulating the market rate. Okay. So I'm sure that was the first part of her question, and I think Susie got the second part.
I think so too. I just wanted to be sure you both feel complete before we jumped into something else. So yes, there is a question here, and this one's from David Burnett. What upcoming bills at the state level should we be following?
Well, one of our bills, which is AB 1695, is on adaptive reuse. So for a very long time, the state would not fund converting existing buildings into housing. And then COVID hit, and then we saw Project Room Key and Project Home Key for people who are unhoused. But also what came out were stories of how expensive it was to build single units. Up to 900,000, it was like 925,000 in San Francisco, 500 to 700,000, up to 837,000 in Los Angeles. And so as these stories started to come out, and more stories started to come out about adaptive reuse, we started to switch the narrative. And now for the first time, cities are going to be able to use the money that they get from the state. And actually a lot of developers will be able to, like nonprofit developers and affordable housing developers will be able to get grants and loans from the government for adaptive reuse, where we can bring housing online in 6 months to a year, maybe less in some cases, and for approximately $100,000 in LA, which is very expensive. $100,000 a unit. So the governor has put $100 million into this budget for adaptive reuse. Miguel Santiago is carrying AB 1695, and this is a huge start because we're recognizing that waiting 3 to 5 years for housing, waiting for years for government financing to come in for affordable housing, and in the meantime, building a lot of housing for people who are fairly rich, actually is a prescription for disaster. And I think my 14-year-old could have told them that a long time ago, but we're here now, and now at least we're trying to fix these things. And there's a lot of tenants' rights bills too that are coming through the pike. A lot of them didn't get anywhere. The Ellis Act, you know, didn't make it through. A lot of them get stuck in committee. Our major housing bills though, SB 9 and 10, no mandate at all for affordable housing. That's a problem. We cannot continue down the road of not providing a mandate for affordable housing. For SB 9 and 10, we asked for 15% of the housing built through those two bills be affordable. And they turned us down. They said, no, we're not adding that. So that tells you where the legislature is right now in terms of its priorities, because those are the two biggest housing bills to have passed through the legislature. And it included nothing for low income folks, included nothing for people who are middle income.
So I also want to bring up some other things that we've had bills, and some are in the pipeline and some aren't. But there are things that can be asked of our individual jurisdictions, like the bare minimum is a rental registry. We cannot put together rental policies if we don't know how much we have in rental property, what their makeup is. We have no data, which is a disadvantage, but it's a planned move for us to be left out of that equation so that we don't have the information needed to help the renters who are the majority in most of our cities. Some other cities have done these with no problem. There has been a bill for a statewide rental registry. We'll see. But in the meantime, all of us can lobby our individual city councils and supervisors for a rental registry. We have cities that are paying in one of the cities in San Francisco area. I'm not sure if it was Berkeley. They were having so many evictions that they made the landlords that were evicting people pay a $10,000 relocation fee. They stopped flipping properties. We can mandate that kind of stuff. We need to get a legal right to counsel bill. It is not okay for renters to go in disadvantaged by not having legal representation when these corporations and these property management companies have lawyers on retainer that literally sit in eviction court every day and just go through a list of people, and renters walk in, if they even take the time off of work, have childcare, they can't compete with that. We have to treat eviction court like criminal court and level the playing field. There are a number of things that other cities are doing. I mean, Susie talked about that, knocking that 10% down, which is obviously one of the best ones. But if you have city councils like we have here that are super resistant to just about anything, it's up to us as their constituents to force them into talking about these issues and taking into consideration that we will vote them out if they refuse to address these conversations in a way that is going to help all of the people in our cities and jurisdictions, not just the wealthy and not just the businesses. And there are baby steps and there are bolder steps. And at the very least, they should be able to start with the baby steps. And not a single one in our county has actually done it. One city, the city of Salinas, has a rental registry that's on the verge of being passed. And that was tried to be accomplished a couple of years ago. And how did they get it done this time? They elected 2 renters to their city council. That's the only reason. And renters, unfortunately, can't afford to run campaigns and run for elected offices. And therefore, we have no representation.
Well, Esther, those are pretty excellent closing words as far as the call to action from you. Susie, do you have any last-minute closing words? Because we are already a minute over, and I wanted really us to be prompt with our timing. And for those of you who didn't have your questions answered, my apologies, but we did promise that we would keep this on time. So you can reach out to either Esther or Susie. Esther, before we jump to Susie for her parting words, do you want to let people know the best way to contact you?
Yes, my email address, we can put it in the chat. And also the group that I formed 5 years ago, Monterey County Renters United, has basically been the main and only voice in our area and our region for renter issues. And after screaming and yelling for 5 years, I feel like we finally at least reached our congressman to have made some progress on these. So we have to do it with our individual councils.
Okay. Can you go ahead and stick your email in the chat, the best way for people to contact you? That's terrific. Thank you. Susie.
Sure. So I would say, first of all, join this growing movement for rent control throughout the country. You can sign up at housinghumanright.org. We are moving for another rent control measure in 2024. So please support that. Again, join that movement. We need to be talking to renters, to people who are low income. We need to understand that like moderate, low, and very low income and extremely low income folks are kind of in this together because we're the ones they're not building housing for. And even though we make up the majority of the constituents, definitely, elect renters, first of all, register renters, get renters out to vote, and make sure that you're electing folks who actually care about renters. And if you can elect renters as well, that would be fantastic. And I just think like there are just these movements really popping up to basically say, we're not going to take this anymore. We, don't want to keep spending most of our income that we're working very hard for on rent. For every, I mean, I think this puts it in perspective. You know, a lot of us worked on the like $15 living wage, which is no longer a living wage. I mean, 20, 25, maybe more. But for all of the workers who have fought really hard for these wage increases, and they're tough, you know, they have to go on a strike, and, you know, they're just tough movements. And we see these great victories, and then whatever that increase is gets eaten up and more in terms of housing increases and rent. And, you know, we just need to stop. We just need to just take control and to say we're not going to continue down this road, and we need to change the paradigm, and we need to flip the script, because, you know, very wealthy people have had their time. That's great. Now it's our time.
Okay. All right. Thank you so much. And do you want to put in the chat for people the best way to contact you with any questions? And in the meantime, I will just say thank you to everyone who has been with us today. Probably in the later fall, maybe early winter, we will be having some elected officials. I believe Congressman Panetta will be joining us at some point to talk about his upcoming bills, and we will probably have other officials from the state, if not the county, here to share their perspectives as well. So thank you all for your time, and we look forward to seeing you again in the near future. Take care. Thank you. Bye-bye. Bye, everyone.